Hello, everyone. It's nice to be with you all this afternoon. I'm Dr. Melinda Griffin with the American Institutes for Research. I am a senior researcher here with a focus on mathematics education and teacher development. I'm also co-lead the Math Collaborative with CCSSO. I'm excited to talk about the topic today, which is differentiating instruction for diverse learners. This is a topic I'm passionate about as I'm a former math teacher and instructional coach myself. So let's get started. So our topic today is differentiating instruction for diverse learners. I want to talk about what exactly is differentiation, because this tends to be a word that's thrown a lot around in education. Why is this important for core instruction, and why is this an important thing to consider when addressing learning gaps? So let's start out thinking about, if I say the word differentiate, what comes to mind? Most people think of differentiation as only applying to low-performing students. In other words, it's something that happens after you've done core instruction in the classroom and you have some kids that just aren't getting it. People often worry that this will take a lot of extra planning time. In other words, how am I going to pull this off when I already don't have much time at hand to get things done? And a lot of teachers worry about, how is this going to work in my classroom? Logistics will often hold teachers back from doing more differentiation. They worry that extra time is needed in the class period, which is already tight, or that students will not be able to handle having different tasks or being able to stay on task with the ones they're given. I would also say that differentiation is many different things. It could be the physical environment, such as where students are seated. Sometimes some children need to be closer to you, others further away. It can also be things like auditory issues in the classroom. It's also how we instruct. So how do we think about the time that we have and how we want to use the time that we have with students each day? And it's most importantly about how students learn best. In other words, what is the way that is best suited to them to be able to access and have an opportunity to learn mathematics? So here's some thoughts on differentiation overall. Differentiation is both formal and informal. It's formal in the sense that we want to try to plan for it as much as we can so that we have it as part of our lesson plan when we start the day, but it often happens informally in the classroom as well. I always think of differentiation as a thing that's only been around for, say, 10, 20 years now. But if you think back to when you were a student, you probably had a teacher who would see maybe some students were having a harder time with a problem, and they'd go through and work an extra example with them. Or maybe they had students who they knew English wasn't their first language, and they would make sure they provided extra language supports for that child. So in other words, it's something that you're going to plan for, as well as something that's going to happen in the moment too. I would also say that differentiation is not individualized instruction, particularly in that more formal sense of what we think of as individualization. It is something that occurs at the classroom level. We want to plan for it at the classroom level, but I would also say that when it's enacted, particularly informally, it does become more personalized. Differentiation is not an afterthought. We often see this happen in that something is taught, students struggle, oh, now we need to differentiate. But if we can work it in at the beginning as part of our core instruction, it's going to provide a better experience for all of our students from the outset. It also works best when it's based on data. In other words, are you differentiating because you know what your students need, or are you differentiating just for the sake of doing it? The second one is not productive for anyone. So we definitely want to check in to see, what do students actually need if we think about differentiation, and put that into play in the classroom. I would also say this is not easy, but it's definitely well worth it. It does take more time to do. You just can't open your teacher manual and teach a differentiated lesson. That being said, there are a lot of resources there to use in your textbook. You have colleagues that differentiate. There are all kinds of resources online, places where you can think about not only what to do in terms of differentiation, but how to go about it. It does require more frequent formative assessment. In other words, we want differentiation to be effective. So in order to do that, we need to be checking in with students more frequently to see where to go next. And it is going to require more frequent instructional adaptations. That is not a bad thing. Some teachers feel like, oh my goodness, I've deviated from my plan. That meant it wasn't planned well, or there's a failure with this lesson. I would say not at all. It just means you're being responsive to your students and you're willing to make those changes on the spot where you need to, either in the moment or thinking about the next day or the day after, rather than just staying with what you have, even if your students aren't learning as well. So let's talk about a differentiation approach. So I think of this as a pre-boost post type of approach. You're going to pre-assess students to find out what they know. Then we're going to move into a routine that can kind of circle or spiral around. I call this boosting for success. So we might use stations, centers, maybe a learning workshop or something. There might be some whole class instruction happening in this. But throughout this, I'm going to want to keep checking in with students regularly to see what they know and then adapt my teaching to go along with that. I also feel it's important to have a post-assessment of some kind. In other words, did things work out with kids the way you'd hope to in the differentiation that you put into play? So let's talk about the pre-assessment first. And this is an area where teachers often balk at this because they very rightly say, I don't have enough instructional time as it is. Am I going to take time away from my actual teaching to assess my students and see what they know? But I would say this is time very well spent in the classroom. It's going to give you data for planning. In other words, you're going to be able to see what kids know ahead of time and then tailor your instruction to meet that. I would also add that it doesn't need to be lengthy or extensive. You just need to think about something fairly short that students can give you so that you have an idea of where they're at in their knowledge. This could be done earlier in the week before you teach a lesson. It could be done the day before or even at the start of class. In other words, we want something that's very close to where the instruction is going to happen. Now, many schools use other types of assessments for students to kind of see where they're at in terms of a grade level. Those are important things to consider overall. But when we think about differentiation in the classroom, we want to get as close as possible to when the instruction is actually going to take place to see what students know. I know when I was a kid, there was lots of fun in the summer and I would come back to school and maybe didn't remember everything right off the bat when I took that first assessment test. But as the year went on and I got back into learning in the classroom, things would come back to me. So we want to give your students the benefit of that doubt too. So how is this going to work? First thing you're going to want to do is find a topic, whatever topic you need to teach. Think about what are the essential skills and or knowledge needed to learn this topic. In other words, what do my students absolutely need to know to be successful with the topic? So this could be a pre-assessment before you go into teaching a whole class instruction. It could also be a pre-assessment to think about what to do with students on a smaller level as well. It can sometimes be helpful to think about a need to know or a nice to know type of chart. In other words, essential things kids have to know to access the mathematics versus things that would be nice to know to help them along the way. And then I want to think about what is an essential question or skill that I could ask my students about to find out what they know. Maybe something from the previous grade levels, mid or end of unit test, if it's a skill that I want them to have coming in. And then I also want to think about what student responses do I expect? In other words, am I going to have some students who may struggle with this? I may have some students who have it, and I may have some students who have it and are ready to move beyond. So you've done a pre-assessment with your students. You've gotten the results back. And the next question is, what do I do with this data? So the first thing you want to think about is how did the data fall out? Did I have maybe 0 to half of my class that really struggled with it and didn't seem to understand the topic at all that I asked about? Or maybe I have 50 to 80% of my kids did pretty well with it. Maybe I have 80 to 100% of my kids that just have it. In that case, I can definitely make some changes structurally, knowing that I don't need to spend as much time on background knowledge with kids. Then I'm going to think about what needs to be taught. Do I need to teach something outright? Do I need to reteach something? Or do I need to just refresh a topic with students? I'll also think about how is this going to happen? Am I going to work on this with the whole class? Do I want to have students grouped in like groups, which will give me a chance to have a common task or question that students work on together? But I may find that my students would benefit from unlike groups, which is going to generate more conversation around a task and allow students to learn from each other by hearing peer-to-peer conversation. So as we think about boosting for success, here's kind of 3 areas to consider. The whole class lesson or mini lesson, in some cases, whether we do a whole class refresh, and then also think about differentiated support that's going to occur throughout this. So let's start by thinking about the whole class lesson. I'm definitely going to use this when most of the class shows a need to learn about a topic or skill. In other words, coming into it, I can tell my students are pretty shaky with the topic. Perhaps if I've asked about a topic that's actually on grade level, I can see that students maybe just haven't had the opportunity to learn this yet at all. So this lesson could be an introduction of a topic, or I could be revisiting previously seen material, depending on what we need to learn. I also want to think about the cost-benefit analysis of time here, okay? Because this is going to be probably a pretty significant chunk of time in my instructional day. So how much of this do I want to devote to the actual lesson where students are learning directly from me? How much perhaps do I want to devote to a discovery type of lesson where students are learning and exploring on their own to come to some conclusions? Or do I need to think about keeping that short enough or maybe splitting it over a couple days so that I provide my students with ample practice time with what they're learning? Sometimes I give a pre-assessment and I find there's maybe a 50-50 split or 60-40 split in terms of students who seem to have a grasp of the topic and others that don't. So in this case, we might consider, instead of teaching a whole class lesson, doing a whole class refresh. This is a more quick review of the topic to refresh it for students. You'll often see this with the topic that was taught in the previous grade level, perhaps earlier in the year in the previous grade level, and students just haven't seen it in a while. So it has to be reintroduced to them. I want to do that review of the topic for students, making sure I hit on the main points. Once again, I'm keeping my cost-benefit analysis of time there. But I definitely want to make sure once I do this that I have my students work another problem, maybe 2, before I really start making my next steps planned. This is going to allow me to see, like, was the refresh enough for students, or at least for the majority of students, where I don't need to consider anything whole class at that point. But that is going to help me think about when I move to differentiation in smaller groups, what might those groups need to do? So a good question is, what's the difference between these words I've been throwing around for the last few minutes? So if I talk about teach a topic, I'm talking usually about new material. This is often something that students have not seen or been exposed to before. That being said, they're connecting it back to things that they already know. So I do want to make sure I do some in-depth coverage here of the topic. I definitely want to spend more time if I'm teaching a lesson versus reteaching. And I want to make sure my kids also have some ample practice time to really solidify that skill. Now, we also know diverse learners learn at different rates. So some students may come away with mastery of this during the first lesson on it, but then other students might need to follow up with it with continued practice going forward. If I'm thinking about reteach, this is often for previously, what I call previously seen material. In other words, it's material that students have been exposed to in the past. Maybe it didn't stick, and that's why you're not seeing knowledge of it now. Or maybe it's just something that's kind of buried at the back of the brain and needs to be brought back to the front. Okay. So I'm going to do some depth of coverage here, not as extensive as if I was teaching it for the first time to a whole class, but enough, some depth. And this might include things like being very picky about the worked examples I do with students, also thinking about vocabulary perhaps that they need coming into this. I do want to make sure my kids have some practice with this before moving on, because I want to make sure I've kind of brought that gap and closed it and tied it up with a bow before I move on to teaching the regular lesson. I also might think about refreshing a topic. So I call this previously learned material. In other words, students know this, but they forget that they know this in some cases. Or perhaps the way it was presented to them is different than how they saw it in the prior grade level. So it doesn't look familiar to them at the onset, but as you do some focused reminders with them around the topic and they see what it is, then it all comes back to them. I still want to do some practice with them before moving on, but this can be more minimal, knowing that My students now have a lead-in skill, and we're going to build on that in the regular lesson. So let's also talk about differentiated support here, because that's an important part of Boost. Differentiated support is in particular important when I've had very varied results on the pre-assessment. In other words, if I look at what students have given me, and I will say it can often be very handy to have an open-ended type of question on that pre-assessment, because I'll get at more students thinking. I might have some students that really understand the topic and might even go beyond what I'm expecting for understanding of the topic. I might have some more students that are kind of middle of the road. Like, I can tell they understand the topic. Sometimes it can be hard to know if they understand it just procedurally or if they understand it conceptually. And then I may have some students that are trying to understand the topic, is how I put it, but they don't quite have it yet. So they may have a glimmer of what the topic is about that you've asked. You might see some initial thought around getting to what the topic means, but you may also have some students who just say, I have no idea. And that's all right. That is important data for you to have as a teacher, because you can work with students from that place. There's nothing worse than asking a student what they need and the student just saying to you, I don't get it. So that's where your pre-assessment is helping here, and that you're going to have a better sense of what they're not getting before you head into classroom instruction. You're also going to think about, in differentiated support, how you're going to target instruction for small groups. Now, that doesn't mean it always has to be a small group as part of your differentiated support. Part of that could be a student thinking individually for a while, perhaps something that happens at the whole class level with a partner share or something like that. But many times students will want, or teachers rather, will want to move into a small group situation that provides much more focused work. You're going to really need to think about the tasks or questions that you're going to put in front of students as part of this differentiated support. This is what comes back to the access and an opportunity part of differentiation. The best tasks in my mind are ones that are more open-ended, that have a low floor and a high ceiling. In other words, most of my kids, if not all of my kids, can access the task, but it's got a long way to go in it. And I can have different levels of understanding within that task. The same is true for questions. I want to think about the questions that I'm going to ask of students as part of differentiation. I may have more questions that I want to ask for a student that's struggling than I do for a student who has it. In those cases, I may want to ask some questions that are going to do more to extend their thinking. Multimodalities plays into this as well. So thinking about how the differentiation occurs. If I go back to teachers thinking about differentiation as remediation, I will often see teachers go back and just try to teach it the same way again. And my thought on that is, if they weren't getting this the first time in that way, maybe we should try something different. So that's where multimodalities can come in. Thinking about maybe your students are more auditory learners. You have many students who may need additional visuals or supports in that respect to be able to actually get to the mathematics. Some students really need to talk it out with someone else so they hear their thinking out loud before they can learn it in a more formal setting. So multimodalities are a consideration as well. I would add in cultural responsiveness here as well. I'm not going to talk extensively about that topic today because there are others in the field who are much more expert in this than I am, but you need to keep that in mind with your students, and that should be kept in mind from the outset. So when we think of differentiation, we often think about using centers or stations. And the reason for this is this gives us our best chance to have targeted differentiation with multiple configurations. Now, many teachers see centers as something that happens in an elementary classroom. Now, and elementary teachers often are masters of doing centers in the classroom because that's how their life runs. It's just part of how they've learned how to teach at that level. I would highly encourage secondary teachers in middle and high school to consider these too. I know my own children were sad to see centers go when they got into secondary education. But students at that level need that differentiation just as much as our elementary students do. It can seem like it's going to be hard to pull off, but you can do it. I want to keep in mind a past, a now, and a future approach when I go into centers. So centers give me a chance to work on some past skills with students. I do want to keep in mind that those past skills actually relate to what we're learning in the classroom now, or will learn soon in the classroom. I would not say that it's highly effective for my high school student to be practicing multiplication facts. They need something else in order to be able to access algebra or geometry. This does give me a chance for students to close some of those learning gaps that they need before moving forward. I might have some stations that focus on the now. In other words, what are we learning at this moment in the classroom? This can be additional practice for students. It can be a chance to dig deeper into the topic. It can also be a chance to perhaps work with something in a hands-on or using a virtual manipulative to help me really think through what the topic is about before I move to the more formal abstract representation of it. My centers can also be future focused. Maybe I want to preview something that's coming up with my students just to see what they think about it. It can be a chance for students to connect what they're learning now to what might come next, and it can be really interesting to see what students come up with as they start to connect those concepts. There are other considerations, I would say, for centers that go beyond just learning math content. So instruction beyond just math needs to happen. You cannot assume that your students know how to work in a center, even if you know for sure that they worked in centers the year before, because you know that teacher, right? They're coming into your classroom. This is a new year. Students have grown and matured in the time since they were in the previous grade. And you probably are going to do things a little differently than the teacher that they had before you. So take some time, invest in your students, and actually talk about and show them, what does it mean to work in centers? What should I expect when I work in centers? What's my expectations from you from a behavior standpoint, as well as my expectations for you from a work standpoint? Management is key when you do centers. And this is, I think, where teachers often shy away from doing them. They worry about the loss of control in the classroom. But if you plan for them going in, you have a much better chance of success. So if I'm grouping students for centers, there might be times when I want more random grouping, right? Maybe I number kids off and then that's the stations they go to. But there's other times when I want much more deliberate grouping happening in a center, because I know that the work that students are doing in that centers depends on the group that they're going to be with. I also want to think about the content and tasks that students are working on in those centers. Are they worthwhile? Will they engage students? And I want to think about the mechanism through which the work is happening. Is there enough space so students can do the work in the center without being highly distracted by someone else? Do they have materials that they need at the center? Are there things they need to bring with them as they go? Having that all thought through and planned out ahead of time will make it go much more smoothly. Checking in with students. So this is another thing to consider in terms of centers. Many times, teachers have students in the classroom and they're rotating from center to center. That's okay, but I would say that the teacher also needs to rotate during this time. Oftentimes, teachers feel like one of those stations should be a teacher-led station. That can be okay to have it during one portion of that for perhaps your students who need the most support at that point. But it shouldn't be there for everybody. At that point, I would say you need to be checking in at the different stations with groups to see where your students are at. This is where a lot of that informal differentiation and support can come into play. And it helps you also get a sense of, were the stations or centers that I set up working? Was the grouping right? Was what they were working on right? Did it work out as planned? Now we're going to do a post-assessment. This is going to help you gauge the progress that your students made. It's going to give you data for planning going forward, and it's going to let you know, was the differentiation successful? So think about whatever task or question you might put in front of students. You might use the same question or task you used on the pre-assessment, or maybe it's something else that gets at more solidifying and mastery of learning. Exit tickets are one of my favorite post-assessments for students. I would often call this show what you know with kids. A big question for you to keep in mind, though, is, are you measuring what you as the teacher want to know? And I often think of exit tickets as falling into two different groups, and you see a couple examples of those here. Depending on what students are learning, I might be wanting to get at procedural fluency. In other words, can they apply a skill that we've learned? But sometimes I might want to get at more conceptual understanding around a topic. And this is often a very open-ended question that doesn't have a divergent answer. Students aren't the only ones post-assessing. You as the teacher also need to do that. How was the setup? What worked well? Did the kids work well together? Do I need to consider that differently last time? Was there adequate time for students to do their work? And were the tasks that I used on point for what I wanted my students to learn and grow in? So in summary, differentiation takes time and deliberate effort, but it provides worthwhile learning experiences for all students, both our students who are perhaps struggling and need some support, as well as our students that are high flyers. Using a pre-assess, boost, and post-assess approach is going to help you make data-based decisions for your students. Thank you all for joining me today, and good luck with trying this out in your classroom.
Final thoughts would be give differentiation a chance. It's good for everyone involved, teacher and students. It will make a much more pleasurable classroom experience and hopefully keep everyone much more engaged in mathematics. So thank you all for joining me today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.